Where there's smoke, is there really a fire? I have been spending the last 2 or 2.5 years now talking about cannabis in the workplace. Really started to take hold when we talked about medicinal cannabis becoming more accepted, more commonplace. Then when our federal government announced that we're going to legalize recreational use, that just kicked it into a whole different gear. And I've been talking about it at conferences, written papers, done seminars, and of course, every other employment lawyer has been doing the same thing. And as legalization date of October 17th approached, it just got into an even higher gear as everyone was talking about how do you deal with cannabis in the workplace. This is we just finished episode 10 of Fire Away, and 2 out of our 10 episodes have been discussing cannabis. So you can tell it's a hot topic. The reality is, though, we are a month into the legalized era. The sky is not fallen. I am not seeing a whole lot of incidents of people who are impaired at work. So the question we're now getting is basically, was this much ado about nothing? In my humble opinion, I think the fears were wildly overblown. In episode 10 of Fire Away, we talked about some of the fears about safety-sensitive positions and this notion that you're going to have to allow your truck driver to get behind the wheel even though they're impaired, or things like that, or you're going to have your lunchroom become a drug den all of a sudden. None of that's happening, and I think the fears have been completely unfounded. But at the same time, we now have cannabis being used medicinally in a far more widespread manner than it was before. We now have cannabis legalized. We have parties coming up, and we talked about that in episode 10 as well. Holiday parties where some avant-garde employers might actually provide cannabis, but even if they're not, you're going to have people who will sneak out and perhaps go and smoke a joint and then come back to the party. And employers are going to be dealing with cannabis more and more often. So the reality is all of this is a great opportunity to remind employers that you need to deal with the situation by having a policy in place. So I want to talk about a few misconceptions, a few key points that people should remember when we talk about cannabis in the workplace, bearing in mind that realistically it's not as big a concern as many people believed. First of all, contrary to popular belief, you do not need to have a cannabis policy. What you need to have is a really well-written drug and alcohol policy that addresses issues of drugs and alcohol generally in the workplace. And the first question I usually get is, can't we just have a one-liner, a one-sentence policy which says, essentially, thou shalt not consume or be impaired by drugs or alcohol at work? Reality is that's a good starting point, but that's not the end of the story. It doesn't take into account human rights issues, addiction, accommodation. It also doesn't take into account the fact that some workers actually will be using alcohol and perhaps even cannabis in the context of their duties. And the best example of that is sales workers. So if you have salespeople who are employed to wine and dine your clients, and yet you have a policy which says you cannot consume alcohol while you're in the course of your duties, you are essentially paying them to breach your policy every single day. And of course, if your practice doesn't comply with your policy, your practice becomes your policy. So it's critical that your practices reflect reality, which is the next point I often make. One size does not fit all. You can have a policy which says that for the vast majority of employees, no alcohol at work, no cannabis at work, but sales employees may be permitted to have alcohol. I'm not sure if you want to go as far as allowing them to go smoke up with a client, but over time, I'm sure we're going to see situations like that as well. The reality is one size does not fit all. So tailor your policy to your organization, to the different roles that you have in the organization. Another important point to make is that medicinal cannabis is not, it's very similar to other medications. So I've had a lot of employer clients who have been up in arms because now we have medicinal cannabis, and what's going to happen? People get a prescription, they're going to come to work high, and we have nothing we can do about it. The reality is you probably already have employees who are using codeine or Oxycontin or NyQuil for that matter, and they're already coming to work high, or impaired, I should say, and you're not even concerned about it. So have a policy which addresses not cannabis, but any prescription medication, and requires that employers make you aware of any such prescriptions so that you will know whether there's any need to accommodate or not. And the reality is you can have a policy which says, if you have a prescription for medication that could cause impairment, you need to make the employer aware of it. There's nothing wrong with having a policy like that. You can also have a policy which says if you have an addiction, then you must advise the employer. And if you fail to and cause some sort of incident at work, you can be disciplined up to including dismissal for that, even though the person has an addiction and it's therefore entitled to accommodation. There's a great Supreme Court of Canada case from just about a year ago now where somebody had a cocaine addiction. The policy was very clear. You have to disclose your addiction. If you do, we'll help you. If you don't disclose it, you come to work impaired, you cause an incident, you'll be fired. And that's exactly what happened. The person was fired. He grieved it. It went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. And the argument was, you fired me because I had a disability, an addiction. And the company said, no, we fired you because you breached the policy. And the Supreme Court of Canada agreed. So that should be good news for employers, that if you have a well-written policy, you can discipline or even dismiss someone that has an addiction if they fail to comply with the policy. Addiction is not a get out of jail free card. So have a really good, thorough, and effective drug and alcohol policy. We're not seeing rampant drug use in the workplace, and I don't think we're going to. The sky is not going to fall, contrary to a lot of the fear-mongering that we heard. But the reality is you should have a policy, and if you don't have a good policy, you're wasting your time. So the last piece of advice I will give, even though it sounds self-serving, is if you're working on your drug and alcohol policy, go see an employment lawyer, make sure they vet it, and make sure that it's written as effectively as it possibly can be. So that's my 2 cents worth, and you got it here for free.